What would you do if the very man who ruined your father left you standing in a courthouse yard, holding nothing but a deed to a dead man's junk? For Delilah Marsh, a young woman with nothing left but her father's pocket watch and a grief that hadn't found its bottom yet, this wasn't a question. It was the splintered boards of an auction platform beneath her worn boots, and the laughter of an entire town ringing in her ears. She had come to Cinder Creek with $11 and a name nobody wanted to say out loud anymore. And when the auctioneer's gavel fell on the very last lot of the day, a rusted, forgotten caboose nobody else had bid on, she was handed a piece of paper and a joke she would spend the rest of her life living down. But what happened in the next 24 hours, in the cold iron belly of that abandoned railcar, would unearth a secret that had been buried under a decade of forged signatures and quiet, patient theft. The truth was waiting for her, sealed behind a rusted panel in a place everyone had already written off as scrap. Settle in and let the smoke of the high country settle with you. This is a story about the things we throw away and the treasures they hold inside. The gavel fell like a small, dry gunshot. Sold. To the lady in the gray shawl. $11. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd gathered in the yard behind the Cinder Creek courthouse, the kind of laughter that didn't need to be loud to be cruel. Delilah Marsh stood with her chin lifted, the auctioneer's slip trembling only slightly in her fingers. Behind her, a voice rose above the rest, smooth and amused. Cornelius Vane didn't need to shout. Men like him never did. Money did the shouting for them. Well now, he said, addressing the crowd more than her. The Marsh girls bought herself a caboose. Rusted clean through, if I recall. Ought to make a fine chicken coop. More laughter. Delilah didn't turn around. She had learned, in the 11 months since her father's death, that turning around only fed men like Vane. He wanted to see her flinch. She would not give him the satisfaction, not here, not in the dust of a bankruptcy auction that had already stripped her family of everything else worth taking. The lot in question sat at the far end of the rail yard, past the water tower and the rotted loading dock, where the Cinder Creek and Western's remaining rolling stock had been dragged to die. 11 cars had gone that day. 10 locomotives, boxcars, and flat cars, snapped up by Vane's agents for pennies on the dollar. And then, at the very end, almost as an afterthought, caboose number 12. Nobody had wanted it. The wheels were seized with rust. The cupola windows were shattered. A family of barn swallows had taken up residence somewhere inside the roof. It was, by any reasonable measure, worthless. It was also the last thing her father had ever worked on. Jonathan Marsh had been a surveyor and junior partner in the Cinder Creek and Western since its founding 26 years earlier. He had ridden in that caboose more times than Delilah could count, had eaten his supper in it, had slept in it during the long surveying seasons when the line was still being cut through the mountains. When the railroad went bankrupt 8 months after his death, and Vane Rail Consolidated swept in to buy up its carcass at auction, the caboose was the one piece nobody at the bank thought to itemize properly. It had been logged simply as car number 12, condition, derelict. $11. It was all she had left in the world, and she had spent every cent of it on a rotting box on wheels that even the scrap buyers hadn't bothered to bid against. Why she'd done it, she couldn't entirely say. Sentiment, she told herself. The last piece of her father she could still touch. What she didn't yet know was that it stood between Cornelius Vane and everything he had built on a lie. The walk to the caboose took her past the wreckage of everything her family had once been part of. The roundhouse, dark and silent, its doors chained. The depot, its windows already boarded up in anticipation of demolition. A hand-painted sign nailed crookedly to the station platform read Vane Rail Consolidated future site of the Redemption Hotel and Depot, and beneath it, smaller, almost an insult in its casualness, Cinder Creek and Western, defunct. Defunct. As if 26 years of her father's life could be filed under a single bureaucratic word. She reached the caboose as the sun was beginning its long slide toward the western ridgeline. Up close, it was worse than she'd let herself imagine. The paint had weathered to a dull, bruised red, peeling in long strips like sunburned skin. The iron railings along the rear platform were furred with rust. One of the steps had rotted through entirely, and she had to haul herself up by the handrail, her boots scraping for purchase on the one that remained. The door groaned on hinges that hadn't turned in years, and a wave of stale, dust-thick air rolled out to meet her. It smelled of old coal smoke and mildew, and something underneath that. Something like cedar, like the inside of the trunk her father had kept his surveying instruments in. Inside, the cupola's shattered windows let in shafts of dying gold light, catching the dust she'd disturbed, turning the whole cramped space into something briefly, strangely beautiful. It was a wreck. It was also, unmistakably, still her father's. His initials were carved into the underside of the fold-down bunk, the way he used to carve them into everything he was proud of. A faded railroad company calendar, for years out of date, still hung crooked on a nail. And in the corner, half collapsed under the weight of the roof's slow decay, sat the little iron stove he used to boil his coffee on cold surveying mornings. She sat down on the edge of the bunk, and for the first time since the funeral, she let herself cry. Not for the money. Not for the humiliation of the auction yard. For him. For the $11 that had bought her one last conversation with a dead man, conducted entirely in dust and silence. It was nothing. It was everything. And it was in the middle of that grief, her hand braced against the wall to steady herself, that she felt it. A give in the wood paneling beneath her palm. A seam that shouldn't have been there. What would you do if the wreck everyone mocked you for buying turned out to be hiding the one thing your enemy needed destroyed? Let us know in the comments what you would have done in Delilah's place. And be sure to subscribe for more stories from the American frontier. She pressed harder, and the panel shifted half an inch with a groan of old, dry wood. It wasn't rot. It was a seam, cut deliberately, fitted so precisely that only years of weather and neglect had allowed it to loosen at all. Her heart, which had been a slow, grieving thing all afternoon, began to pound. Working her fingers into the gap, she pulled. The panel resisted, then gave all at once, nearly sending her sprawling backward into the narrow aisle. Behind it was a cavity built into the wall itself, no more than 8 inches deep, but long, running the length of the bunk. And inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and brittle with age, was a strong box no larger than a bread loaf, its iron surface pitted but intact. For a long moment, she didn't move. The swallows rustled somewhere above her in the eaves. The last of the sun caught the strongbox's tarnished latch and turned it, briefly, to gold. Everyone in Cinder Creek believed the railroad's collapse was simple bad luck. A line built too fast, too far into the mountains, bled dry by a falling silver market and a decade of hard winters. That was the story Cornelius Vane had told the bank examiners. It was the story he had told the newspaper. It was the story, she realized now with a cold, creeping certainty, he had needed everyone to believe. This little forgotten car, dismissed as scrap, dragged to the end of the yard and sold for $11 to a grieving girl nobody thought twice about, had been hiding something for years. Something worth burying deeper than rust and dust and the slow decay of neglect. She pulled the strongbox free. It was heavier than its size suggested, and something inside shifted with the dry whisper of paper. The latch was rusted shut. She found her father's old surveying hammer still hanging from its hook by the stove, and with 3 careful strikes, the corroded metal gave way. Inside, wrapped in a second layer of oiled canvas to protect it from the damp, was a single leather-bound ledger, and beneath it, folded in quarters and sealed with wax that had cracked but never broken, a document bearing a header she recognized instantly, because she had seen its twin hanging framed and forgotten in her father's old office. The founder's charter of the Cinder Creek and Western Railroad Company, established this 14th day of March, 1871. A founding share. That much she had always known, a point of quiet, threadbare pride in a household that had precious little else to be proud of. Everyone, herself included, had long assumed those shares were worthless paper, wiped out along with everything else when the company folded. Buried on the charter's 3rd page, though, in the same careful copperplate hand as the rest of the document, sat a clause she had never known existed, one that had apparently been forgotten by everyone still living except the one man who had spent a decade making very sure it stayed that way. Twice she read it, to be certain she understood it correctly. This was not a worthless keepsake. It was the deed to an entire railroad. Cornelius Vane had not always been a man people were afraid to look in the eye. 10 years earlier, he had been a junior clerk in the Cinder Creek and Western's finance office, a thin, ambitious man with a talent for numbers and a hunger that the town had mistaken, for a time, for simple diligence. He had watched the railroad's founders, Jonathan Marsh among them, build something honest out of a hard, unforgiving stretch of mountain track. And he had watched, with a resentment he never let show on his face, as the profits of that honest work passed him by year after year, always destined for men whose names were already carved into the founders' charter. The charter itself had been drafted in a hopeful season, when the line's 5 founding partners, flush with the optimism of a new venture, had written into their agreement a safeguard against exactly the kind of predation men, like Vane, would one day practice. If the company ever defaulted on its founding bonds, and if that default persisted beyond 90 days without resolution, full ownership of the company's assets would revert automatically to the founders or their direct heirs, superseding any bankruptcy sale, any bank seizure, any subsequent transfer of stock. It was a clause meant to protect the men who had built the railroad with their own hands from ever being cheated out of it by outside capital. For 10 years, Cornelius Vane had made sure that clause was never invoked, while anyone who remembered it was still alive to invoke it. He had done it patiently. He had done it the way a man drains a well slowly enough that no one notices the water level dropping, one dry season at a time. First, he had gotten himself appointed to the finance committee. Then, over the following years, he had quietly acquired the outstanding debt of 3 of the 5 founders, buying up their shares under false company names whenever hardship forced them to sell, or in 2 cases, arranging for that hardship himself. A bad harvest here, a called-in loan there, a rumor whispered into the right ear at the right moment. One founder had died of a fever the town doctor, a man on Vane's private payroll, had been curiously slow to treat. Another had simply vanished west one winter and never been heard from again, his shares conveniently signed over before he left, in a signature nobody had thought to question at the time. Jonathan Marsh had been the last of the 5 original founders still holding his shares outright, and the hardest to remove, because he was stubborn and honest, and utterly uninterested in selling anything to Cornelius Vane at any price. There had been a moment, early on, when a different man might have stopped. Jonathan Marsh, still trusting then, still believing the finance committee served the railroad rather than itself, had once recommended Vane for a modest promotion, calling him in a company memo diligent beyond his years, and deserving of greater responsibility. Vane had kept that memo, not out of gratitude, out of the particular, cold calculation of a man who understood that the people who trusted you first were always the easiest to eventually betray, because they never thought to watch you closely enough. So Vane had done what he always did when patience wasn't fast enough. He had engineered the default himself. The strongbox's ledger told the story in the flat, damning language of numbers rather than accusation, but the story it told was unmistakable. Delilah sat on the floor of the caboose with the lantern from the cupola shelf lit against the gathering dusk, and she read her father's careful handwriting fill page after page with entries that made her stomach turn. 6 years ago, a shipment of bonds meant to cover the railroad's spring interest payment had been rerouted through a bank in Denver that, the ledger noted in her father's own hand, did not appear in any registry of chartered institutions. The bonds had simply disappeared into that phantom bank and never reappeared, leaving the Cinder Creek and Western unable to meet its obligations for the first time in its history. Her father had known. He had written a full account of his suspicions, dated and signed, along with correspondence he'd copied by hand showing Vane's fingerprints all over the rerouted transaction. He had been building a case, methodically, the way he built everything, brick by careful brick. And then, according to the county coroner's report tucked into the ledger's back pages, he had died of a sudden apoplexy at his desk, alone, on a night when his usual walking companion, an old friend from the surveying crew, had been unexpectedly called away on other business by a summons that, Delilah now realized with a horror that closed her throat, had come from Vane's own office. She had been told her father died of natural causes. She had believed it, because grief does not leave much room for suspicion, and because there had been no reason, then, to look for another explanation. Now there was a reason. Now there was a ledger, and a charter, and a clause that meant the 90-day default window her father had died trying to expose had, according to the bankruptcy filings from 8 months ago, finally and irrevocably closed. Which meant, if the clause was as ironclad as her father's careful annotation suggested, that ownership of the entire Cinder Creek and Western Railroad, its track, its rolling stock, its depot. Every acre of right-of-way Vane had spent a decade stealing by inches, had already, silently, legally, reverted to her. The only surviving heir of the only founder who had never sold. That was what she was now. For a long time she sat very still, the lantern guttering, the strongbox open in her lap, and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that she had just become the most dangerous person in Cinder Creek, and that Cornelius Vane did not yet know it. He found out sooner than she would have liked. It was full dark by the time she climbed down from the caboose, the strongbox wrapped again in its oilcloth and clutched against her chest like something that might shatter. She had meant to go straight to the county recorder's office in the morning, but as she crossed the darkened rail yard, she saw a lantern moving between the abandoned freight cars, and beneath it, unmistakably, the tall, deliberate shape of Cornelius Vane himself. He was not alone. Two men flanked him, the kind of men who did not carry lanterns of their own, who existed in the half-dark at the edges of other men's business. Miss Marsh. Vane's voice carried easily across the empty yard, pleasant as ever, the same voice he'd used to mock her from the auction platform that afternoon. A bit late for a young lady to be out among the wreckage, isn't it? I bought this wreckage fair and square, she said, keeping the strongbox angled behind her skirts, out of the lantern light. Same as your men bought the rest of it. So you did. He stepped closer, and in the yellow light she could see the faint, calculating narrowing of his eyes, the look of a man doing sums in his head. Rather a lot of interest in a rusted caboose, though. My foreman tells me you spent the better part of the afternoon in it. Sentiment, she said. My father died in that railroad service. I wanted to see the last car he worked on before your company tears it apart for scrap metal. It was, she thought, a reasonably good lie. Vane did not appear to believe a word of it. Your father, he said slowly, was a fine surveyor. Meticulous. The sort of man who kept very thorough records. His eyes dropped, for just a fraction of a second, to the bundle held tight against her side. I trust you found nothing more interesting in there than old timetables. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the tick of cooling iron somewhere in the yard and the distant call of a nightjar. Nothing that concerns you, she said finally, and turned to walk toward the road, her spine rigid, every muscle in her body braced for the sound of footsteps following her. They did not follow. Not that night. But she knew, with the same cold certainty her father must have felt in his final weeks, that Cornelius Vane had just decided she was a problem that needed solving, and that men like him did not solve problems slowly once they had made up their minds. She did not trust the county recorder's office. Not yet. Not until she understood exactly how deep Vane's reach extended into the town's institutions. Her father's ledger named names, the coroner, the bank in Denver, a county assessor who had signed off on land transfers that should never have been legal, and she had no way of knowing, in the dark of that first terrible night, which offices in Cinder Creek were safe to walk into, and which were simply extensions of Cornelius Vane's will. There was one man in town her father had trusted absolutely. A former locomotive engineer named Thomas Hale, who had run the Cinder Creek and Western's mountain grade for 15 years before a boiler explosion, caused by cut corners on maintenance that Vane's finance office had personally approved, had killed 6 men and left Hale with a permanently scarred hand and a wife in an early grave. Dead not from the blast itself, but from the fever that took her in its aftermath, when the company doctor, the same doctor who had failed to treat Jonathan Marsh's fatal collapse, had been too slow again. Hale had retreated after that to a small, isolated section house at the edge of the grade, the last stretch of track before the mountains, where he maintained switches and signals for a company he had every reason to hate and nowhere else to go. He kept to himself. He asked no questions of anyone, and offered no answers in return. Delilah had met him only once, as a child, when her father had brought her along on a surveying trip, and Hale had lifted her up into the cab of his locomotive to let her pull the whistle cord. She remembered his hands, careful and enormous, and the scar that ran across the back of the right one. It was past midnight when she reached his section house, her legs aching, the strongbox growing heavier with every mile. She knocked, and after a long silence, a lamp flared inside, and the door opened on a man she barely recognized, grayer now, more weathered, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had stopped expecting anything good to knock on his door. Miss Marsh. He said it the way Vane had said it, but there was no mockery in it. Only recognition, and something that might have been wariness. "It's late." "I know," she said, and her voice broke, just slightly on the words. "I need your help. And I think you're the only man left in this town my father would have trusted to give it." Hale looked at her for a long moment, at the exhaustion in her face, the bundle clutched against her chest, and something in his expression shifted, the flicker of a man recognizing, for the first time in a year, a piece of unfinished business he hadn't realized he was still waiting to complete. "You'd better come in," he said, "and tell me everything." She told him everything, sitting at his small kitchen table while a fire burned low in the hearth and the strongbox lay open between them, its contents spread across the scarred wood in the lamplight. Hale read the ledger in near total silence, his jaw tightening by degrees as he moved through her father's careful accounting of Vane's decade-long theft. When he finally set the pages down, his scarred hand rested flat on the table, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with an old, banked fury. "I always knew that boiler was rigged to fail," he said. "I told the company inspector 6 months before it happened that the pressure valves needed replacing. Vane's office denied the requisition. Twice." He looked up at her. "I buried 6 men because of a signature on a piece of paper I never got to see. This," he tapped the ledger, "this is the paper." "There's more," Delilah said, and turned to the charter, to the clause on its 3rd page. She watched his face as he read it, watched the shock arrive, and then, slowly, resolve into something harder. "You understand what this means," he said finally. "If this clause is valid, and if the default truly ran its 90 days without resolution, you don't just have a claim against Vane. You own the railroad outright. Every mile of track, every car, every locomotive he thinks he bought fair and square this afternoon." "I know," she said, "and I know he's already realized something's wrong. He as good as told me so tonight." Hale was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "Then we don't have much time," he said. "A charter like this needs to be filed and validated by a federal land office before anyone can act on it safely. Vane knows every clerk and judge in Cinder Creek County. File it here, and he'll have it buried or burned before the ink's dry on the recorder's stamp. We need to get this in front of someone he can't reach." "Where?" "Denver," he said. "The Territorial Land Office keeps the master registry of every railroad charter filed west of the Divide. If this document is what it claims to be, they'll have the original charter on file to compare it against, and there won't be a thing Vane can do about it once it's registered there." "That's 2 days' ride." "It is." He was already moving, pulling a leather satchel down from a shelf, checking the action on a rifle that had clearly not been touched in some time. "Which means we leave tonight, before Vane decides that caboose of yours needs to disappear along with everything in it." They left before the moon had fully cleared the eastern ridge, Delilah on a borrowed mare, Hale leading the way on a rangy gelding he called Ezra, the strongbox wrapped tight in oilcloth and lashed behind her saddle. The night was cold and clear, the kind of high-country cold that made every breath visible, and they rode in a silence that felt less like distance between them and more like a shared understanding of exactly how much was riding alongside them in that leather satchel. Is survival worth the cost of unearthing a decade of buried lies? Let us know what you'd risk and stay with us, because the story is only beginning. Dawn found them still moving, riding through the first gray hours without stopping, following the old wagon road that shadowed the rail line's original survey, the same route Jonathan Marsh had walked and ridden 100 times in his years cutting the grade through the mountains. Hale knew every turn of it from memory, every place a horse might stumble in poor light, every dry wash that could hide a man waiting in ambush. It was Hale who first noticed the dust rising behind them, a thin gray smudge against the brightening sky, still miles back, but closing with a steadiness that told him it was no accident of wind. "Riders," he said. 3, maybe 4. Moving fast. Vane's men. Nobody else has reason to be moving that fast on this road. He turned his horse off the main track, into a stand of scrub pine that offered at least the illusion of cover. "We need to lose them before dark, or find somewhere defensible if we can't." Pushing the horses harder than either animal wanted to be pushed, they cut cross-country through broken foothill country that Hale navigated by instinct and old memory, away from the road, toward a series of dry canyons that fed eventually, he said, into the valley that held Prescott's territorial capital, still the better part of a day's ride distant. By late afternoon, the dust behind them had closed to something visible even without turning in the saddle, and Hale's face had settled into the flat, grim calculation of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. "We're not going to outrun them to Denver," he said. "Not with tired horses and a 2-day head start they've already eaten half of. Then what do we do?" He looked at the canyon walls rising on either side of them, red rock going gold in the lowering sun, and something in his expression sharpened. "We make them come to us somewhere we choose the ground," he said, "instead of somewhere they do." The place he chose was a narrows where the canyon pinched down to barely 20 feet across, walls sheer on both sides, the kind of choke point a man could hold with a rifle against considerably more than 3 or 4 riders if he had the nerve for it, and a reason worth having it. They didn't have long to wait. The riders came on at a hard trot as the light failed, and in the lead, unmistakable even at a distance by the particular contemptuous ease of his posture in the saddle, rode a man Hale identified with a single flat word. Reeves. His voice carried no surprise, only a tired, bitter recognition. Vane's foreman. Handles the jobs. Vane doesn't want his name anywhere near. The foreman reined up at the mouth of the narrows, his 2 companions flanking him, and did not bother dismounting. "Evening, Hale," he called, his voice carrying easily off the canyon walls. "Mr. Vane would like a word with the young lady's baggage. Says there's been some confusion about what belongs to who." "There's no confusion," Delilah called back, her voice steadier than she felt. "The law will settle whose it is soon enough, in Denver, in front of a federal registrar. You're welcome to ride along and watch." An ugly, practiced laugh answered her. "Mr. Vane's already sent word ahead to Denver, miss. Man in his position has friends in a good many offices. I expect whatever paper you're carrying will find itself lost in some clerk's desk drawer long before you get there." His hand drifted, with unhurried menace, toward the rifle scabbard at his saddle. "Be a good deal simpler for everyone if you just handed it over now." The shot that answered him came from Hale, deliberately placed to kick up rock and dust a foot from Reeves's horse rather than anywhere near the man himself. A warning rather than an opening move, but a warning made with unmistakable intent. "Next one won't miss on purpose," Hale said. "Ride back and tell Vane his Caboose deal just got a good deal more expensive than $11. What followed was short, chaotic, and ugly in the particular way violence is ugly when it happens in poor light, between people who mostly don't want to die over a piece of paper, but have run out of better options. Reeves's men scattered for what cover the canyon offered. Hale's return fire kept them pinned rather than pursuing, and in the confusion, Delilah found herself flat against the canyon wall with the strongbox clutched to her chest, her heart slamming against her ribs, understanding for the first time in her sheltered, grieving life exactly how much her father's death had actually cost, and exactly what kind of men had been willing to pay it. It ended when one of Reeves's men took a graze along the forearm and lost his nerve entirely, and Reeves, weighing the odds of a running gunfight in bad light against a rifleman who clearly knew the ground better than he did, called the retreat with a curse that echoed off the rock long after his horse's hooves had faded into the dusk. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They had fought for the charter, and now, in every sense that mattered, it owned them completely. They made camp that night in a shallow draw well off the main road, a cold fire and colder rations, and neither of them slept easily. Delilah sat with her back against a boulder still warm from the day's sun, the strongbox within arm's reach, and watched Hale clean the rifle he'd fired twice that evening with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything. "You didn't have to come," she said finally. "Any of it. The riding, the shooting. It isn't your fight." He didn't look up from the rifle. 6 men died under my hands because Vane's office wouldn't spend the money to replace a pressure valve," he said. "My wife died in the fever that came after, because the same doctor who let your father die was too busy protecting his patron to treat her properly. I've spent a year telling myself there was nothing left to do about any of it except keep the switches oiled and wait to die quiet myself." He set the rifle down and finally met her eyes. "This is the first thing that's felt like doing something in a long while. Don't thank me for it. Just don't waste it." She didn't have an answer for that, not one that felt equal to what he'd said, so she said nothing at all, and they sat together in the dark a while longer, listening to the wind move through the canyon, until sleep finally took them both. Riding out again before first light, they found the second day harder than the first, the horses tiring, the trail growing rockier as it climbed toward the pass that would drop them, eventually, into the valley holding Prescott. Twice they thought they heard riders behind them again, and twice it proved to be nothing more than wind moving loose rock down a slope. But the fear of it rode with them regardless, a tightness in the shoulders that didn't ease until the territorial capital's scattered lights finally came into view below them in the blue dusk of the second evening, looking, to Delilah's exhausted eyes, like the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Prescott's territorial land office received them the following morning, trail-worn, exhausted, and carrying, in a strongbox that had survived a bankruptcy sale, a long-buried conspiracy, and a running gunfight in a mountain canyon, the single most valuable piece of paper in the Cinder Creek Valley. The chief registrar, a severe, precise man named Aldous Whitfield, whose reputation for incorruptibility was, Hale had assured her on the ride in, the very reason Vane's reach did not extend this far, listened to their account without interruption, his expression giving away nothing. When they finished, he held out his hand for the charter without a word, and spent the better part of an hour comparing it, page by page, against the original filing his office had kept on record since 1871, a duplicate copy that predated any of Vane's decade of quiet theft, and could not, therefore, have been forged, altered, or bought. "The seal is authentic," he said finally, setting the two documents side by side. "The signatures match our archival copy, in every particular. And the default clause," he tapped the third page with one long finger, "is entirely valid, entirely enforceable, and entirely unambiguous." He looked up at her, and for the first time something that might almost have been sympathy crossed his severe features. "Miss Marsh, based on the documents before me, and pending formal verification against the county's bankruptcy filings, you are the sole surviving founding shareholder of the Cinder Creek and Western Railroad Company, and as such, the sole rightful owner of its entire remaining assets." The words landed with a strange, floating unreality, the way news that changes everything so often does. "There's more," Hale said quietly, and laid her father's ledger on the desk beside the charter. "Evidence of the fraud that engineered the default in the first place. Rerouted bonds. A murdered founder. A doctor paid to look away." Whitfield read the ledger's opening pages in silence, his jaw tightening exactly as Hale's had, back at that kitchen table 2 nights before, and when he finished, he rose from his desk. "I'll be dispatching a federal marshal to Cinder Creek within the hour," he said. "Fraud of this scale, involving the deliberate engineering of a corporate default, falls well within federal jurisdiction. Mr. Vane, I suspect, is about to discover that some debts don't stay buried, no matter how deep the ground." The marshal Whitfield sent, a tall, unhurried man named Corbin who had the particular stillness of someone who had stopped being surprised by human greed a long time ago, rode into Cinder Creek 3 days later with a deputized posse of 6 men, a certified copy of the charter, and a federal warrant that named Cornelius Vane in language a great deal less polite than anything the town's own newspaper had ever dared print about him. Delilah rode in beside them, Hale at her side, the original charter and ledger secured now not in a rusted strongbox, but in a federal courier's locked case, and watched as the town that had laughed at her 11 days earlier fell into a stunned, uncertain silence at the sight of them. Vane was arrested at his office above the depot, his face, according to the clerk who witnessed it, arranging itself first into disbelief and then into a hollow, comprehending stillness as Marshal Corbin read the charges aloud. Reeves was found within the hour, nursing a scraped ego and a story about ambush riders in the mountains that fell apart the moment Corbin produced the marshal's own account of the gunfight in the Narrows, an account built from Hale's sworn testimony and confirmed, damningly, by the graze wound one of Reeves's men still carried on his arm. Within the week, federal auditors arrested the bank official who had processed the rerouted bonds, the paper trail from Delilah's father's ledger leading them straight to the phantom Denver institution that had never existed under any chartered name. The county assessor confessed within a day of being shown the documents, weeping, according to those present, with a relief that suggested he had been waiting a long time to stop carrying his part of the secret alone. Cinder Creek's memory of itself, built for years on the comfortable fiction that Cornelius Vane was a shrewd but honest businessman who had simply outmaneuvered a failing railroad, began to fracture and rewrite itself in real time. In the same courthouse yard where Delilah had stood 11 days earlier, listening to Vane mock her for spending her last $11 on a rusted caboose. Held before a federal circuit judge in Prescott rather than any court Vane might have hoped to influence, the trial itself lasted the better part of 2 weeks. Delilah testified twice, once to the discovery of the strongbox and once, more difficult, to the ambush in the canyon narrows, her voice steady even as she described the sound of Reeves's gunfire echoing off rock. Hale's testimony, delivered in the same flat, unhurried cadence he brought to everything, carried a weight the courtroom seemed to feel physically. 6 dead men given names and families at last. A widow's fever traced back to a doctor's deliberate negligence. Years of quiet theft laid out in the very ledger Jonathan Marsh had died trying to complete. Vane's own attorneys attempted, in the trial's final days, to argue that the founder's charter itself was ambiguous, that the 90-day clause had never been intended for enforcement, that a decade of quiet acquisition constituted its own kind of legitimate ownership regardless of the methods used to achieve it. The circuit judge, a dry, exacting man with little patience for arguments built on the comfortable erosion of plain language, took less than an hour to dismiss the claim in its entirety, noting for the record that a clause written explicitly to prevent exactly this kind of predation could hardly be reinterpreted, after the fact, to permit it. Cornelius Vane was convicted on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to the wrongful death of a company doctor's negligent patient, a legal formulation the newspapers simplified, not unfairly, to murder by omission. He was sentenced to 20 years in the Territorial Penitentiary. Reeves received a lesser sentence for his role in the ambush, delivered with a bitterness in open court that suggested he had expected, right up until the verdict, that his employer's money would somehow reach even here. As he was led in chains from the courtroom toward the wagon that would carry him to the penitentiary, Vane's eyes found her one last time across the gallery. The mockery that had lived so easily on his face for a decade was entirely gone now, replaced by something hollow, incomprehending, and far too late. He was not merely defeated. He was undone, his fortune built on the very theft that had just handed his victim's daughter the entire railroad he had spent 10 years quietly stealing. Months passed. The valley, which had spent 10 years in the kind of quiet that comes from everyone knowing something and no one saying it aloud, began, slowly, to breathe differently. Delilah did not sell the railroad, though offers came from investors as far away as Chicago. Within weeks of the newspapers picking up the story, she took the founder's charter to a printer instead and had it reprinted, framed, and hung in the depot's front window, where anyone who wished could read, in full, exactly what a founding partnership was supposed to protect and exactly how close it had come to being stolen entirely. Thomas Hale took over as the line's chief engineer, a position he had, in every practical sense, already been performing unpaid and unthanked for 15 years. Under his hand, the mountain grade that had claimed 6 lives to Vane's cut corners was rebuilt properly, boiler by boiler, valve by valve, with a thoroughness that left no room for anyone to ever again cut a corner Hale had personally inspected. The recovered government bonds, the ones Vane had never managed to fully launder before his arrest, went, at Delilah's direction, toward a new schoolhouse and a proper company doctor, hired from the territorial capital, whose contract explicitly forbade him from ever again being on any single man's private payroll. Caboose number 12 was not scrapped. It was restored instead, its rusted wheels replaced, its shattered cupola glass reset pane by careful pain, and it was returned to active service on the line it had once nearly been discarded from, still bearing, on a small brass plate Hale insisted on mounting near the door, the words, "Restored in memory of Jonathan Marsh, founder, and in honor of the daughter who refused to let his work be forgotten." Delilah had a small brass plaque mounted near the depot's front door that autumn, its inscription simple: "A founding stone, once properly set, cannot be pried loose no matter how patient the hands that try." It was not meant to honor any single man. It was meant as a plain reminder to whoever passed beneath it that ownership, real ownership, was a thing built on record and right, not on the length of time a lie went unquestioned. The town itself changed slowly, the way towns do, Not all at once, but in 100 small decisions made by people who had spent years looking away and were only now learning what it felt like to look straight at things instead. The newspaper that had once printed Vane's version of the railroad's collapse without a single question ran, in its autumn edition, a full accounting of Jonathan Marsh's original ledger, his name restored at last to the founding history of the line he had helped build and died trying to protect. Children in the new schoolhouse, funded by the recovered government bonds, studied its founding charter as a civics lesson in what a contract was meant to mean, and what happened to towns that let contracts be quietly hollowed out from the inside. One evening in late autumn, as the light went gold and long across the rail yard, Hale found Delilah standing at the depot window, looking at the framed charter that had cost her father his life and given her, in the end, everything he had spent his own life building. "You could have sold it all," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Taken the money and built yourself a new life somewhere nobody had ever laughed at you." She was quiet for a moment, watching the last light catch the rails stretching west toward the mountains her father had once surveyed on foot, one careful measurement at a time. "The railroad was never the treasure," she said finally. "It was just the key." She looked at him, and for the first time in a very long while, her smile was entirely unguarded. "This is the treasure. All of it. What we're building now." Behind them, the evening freight from the mountain grade sounded its whistle, long and clear and entirely unafraid, echoing off canyon walls that had once nearly buried the truth for good, and did not, in the end, manage to keep it down. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this story of quiet vindication and hard-won justice. It's a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things in this world are the ones everyone else has already decided to throw away. If Delilah and Thomas's journey moved you, we'd be honored if you'd leave a like, and let us know in the comments which part of their story stayed with you longest. Be sure to subscribe for more tales of the American frontier. We'll see you next time.